While occupying the Victoria Park studio, I painted and drew many portraits of people, as well as hand-coloring old black and white photographs for local photo studios. I created designs for LED lighting manufacturers, textile printers, and local tattooists. I believe that despite my warnings, some tattooists using those designs have included my signature. Although I did not want my signature to appear on anyone's skin, I could only hope they were not aware of it. I did not see any need to feel apologetic about that because people seemed to love my artwork, proudly displaying it. I was exceedingly happy that my works of art were appreciated and valued. My humble studio needed further advertisements, and I did not object to some of the local government publications and brochures, as well as schools wanting to include my business while featuring the image of a young lad whose large portrait I had created in soft pencils when I stayed back to complete certain jobs for an architect. That image was not of a physical, living young person, but after an unusual experience I had. Since I'm capable of visualizing, a few architects I was befriended with requested the artist's concept as illustrations for their design ideas. That experience of drawing the portrait of the young child had occurred while I was working on such an architectural design idea. During those few evenings, having stayed back in my studio and feeling obliged to draw that portrait, I was singing one of my favorite songs, Nessun dorma, none shall sleep. The time was well beyond midnight, and I thought I should stay and continue with the project I started for another half an hour. While pondering on the subject at hand, I suddenly became aware of golden flash of light out of the corner of my eye, and clearly heard the voice of a little child behind me asking, "Are you the artist?" It sounded like a beautiful flute being played, and I was thoroughly shocked, while my hair stood on end. I turned around immediately and saw a circa 6-year-old little boy in extremely old-fashioned attire. I first asked him where his parents were. I felt terrified about the thought of a child who had been lost. But where did he come from? All my doors were closed. They were so heavy that no child could so easily push and enter the studio, especially after they had been locked. Had he come in before closing time and fallen asleep in the back, perhaps? It was so unusual. I decided to call the police immediately for help. But as soon as I started dialing the number, the child asked me again, "Are you the artist?" I answered him with a hesitant yes, and asked, "But how did you get in here?" In that moment he faded into thin air. That was extremely disconcerting and worried me immensely. I put it down to being very fatigued and decided to go home. I was wondering how our minds could play tricks, making us see things without being there, for they might never have existed in the first place. However, I could not get over the experience, which was so real to me. The next day I continued with my normal activities, and in the evening, after a light meal, I persisted with my project. The shopping center was closed, and there were not many people on the street. I tidied the studio for the next day's activities, and made myself a strong Greek Turkish coffee, thinking about the design I was working on. After midnight, once again, I became aware of the voice of the little boy who had visited me last night. Clothed exactly the same way as before, he asked in a very harmonic, sweet voice, "Are you the artist?" Again I answered him with a hesitant, "Yes, I am." But can one guess how I felt about this phenomenon? Considering it as possibly being a trick presented by an exterior source, or even by my own mind. I had too many things to ponder about, therefore I wondered what could this be for. This time I was a little more relaxed about this incident, yet at the same time very curiously asked if this was a new trick my mind was playing, but I had no proper explanation for it. However, in light of my professional background, I started to panic. What was happening to me? The child I was looking at was as physical as anybody else, and his unusual disappearance last night was still in my mind. I thought that either my mind was overly busy and tired, or I was eventually going to discover what was really happening. The little boy stood in front of me, tossed his long brown hair to one side, and asked me again, "Are you the artist, sire?" I answered him calmly, "Yes, I am." He asked, "Are you Michelangelo?" This time I answered him with, "No, my name is Suren." He looked surprised, and said almost in a whisper, "Oh, it's okay then." I looked at him, stunned, while holding a tiny paintbrush with my right hand as he began to slowly fade away into the decor. I was reasonably calm at the time, but in truth also very concerned. I pondered about how I had recently experienced great emotional trauma, with my family having rejected me completely due to religious purity. On one side, I was trying to bury the past in the past. On the other, was looking for new vistas as life continued. Was I overly fatigued? Was my mind trying to escape the circumstances one had to endure? Was I having a brainstorm? So thinking, I closed the shop, went home, and contacted a friend in Sydney. He was also a behavioral psychologist, and I thought that perhaps listening to some other opinion would help me. He was very friendly, advising me to take a few days' break and a mini holiday. He even asked me to visit him. That sounded reasonable, and I could certainly do that, for I thought it might be what I needed, intending to fly to Sydney sometime soon. The next day, after a reasonably quiet day in the studio, I was intended to continue with my project and complete it during the night. I did not anticipate anything like the last 2 nights happening again. After the shops were closed, I locked my doors and made a hot cup of coffee before starting to put the finishing touches to my special project. I visualized creative work of the architect's floor plans. However, at about the same time as the other 2 nights, I became aware of the golden flash of light, and again heard the voice of the young lad asking his usual questions. He was in his original attire, and next to him stood an elderly gentleman in an old-fashioned brown cloak and hood. The young one asked again, "Art thou the artist, sire?" I responded with an affirmative nod. I thought there must be some significance for this phenomenon, but I did not know what it could be. He asked further, "Art thou Michelangelo, sire?" For a moment I was speechless, and then I told my young guest, "My dear young friend, I am Suren." Then asked the young boy, with forever questioning eyes fixed upon mine, "Canst thou draw mine portrait now, sire?" For a brief moment I thought that probably I was going crazy, and was talking to myself, but then again there were human figures in front of me asking me questions, and I decided to play this game for the time being. I told my forever questioning young friend, "If you keep disappearing, I cannot do it. If you can stay there, I will draw your image." After a brief silence, young lad looked at the older gentleman, then directly into my eyes and to my hands. I smiled and put a large sheet of paper on the board, started to draw the first outlines, and slowly worked on the shades. First I started with his ever-questioning eyes, then nose, lips, and built the portrait of this child around it with an expression in his beautiful eyes. While spraying the work of my soft pencil art with a protective coating, I noticed how happy these two lovely individuals were. It felt as if there was a promise to draw the portrait of this young man, which had been forgotten. There was great joy in the air, for I had kept my promise. The young lad was the happiest. When children are happy and smiling, it means something wonderful to me. About 5 hours or so later, both my wonderful visitors slowly vanished into thin air. I decided never to sell this work of art to anybody, but keep and treasure it. Interestingly, while I was working on that portrait, I was asking the child in my mind, "You are a projection out of my mind, are you not?" I still remember so clearly how his eyes were directed into mine, as if to answer my silent question. "No, believe me, I am not projected from your mind." Since then, this experience has never been repeated, and I have never seen that child again. I still think that hopefully I did not cause any concerns to that young lad. But perhaps I had to create that image for myself. Maybe it was to awaken something about my personality. I cannot say. However, I will repeat myself once again by saying that there are so many unknowns in life, and I am sure that we will eventually learn all about them. I have kept and treasured that portrait which I nicely framed. Even many years later, when I feel gloomy or troubled, I gaze upon that image, and it still asks me, "Why worry?" and still advises me, "Nothing is worth worrying, but everything in life is worth enjoying and living." Later I decided to draw the portrait of my son as I remembered him when I saw him for the very last time, utilizing photographs I had taken of him. Even at that young age he was subjected to completely unnecessary trauma and worries. By looking into his eyes, anybody could sense the feeling of desperation, fear, and being lost. To me he was just the same after several years, and I have drawn his image as I remembered, expressing his emotions. I also framed it the same as the portrait of the lad. From then on, occasionally I felt that those works of art were talking to me. I often looked at my son's image, smiling, and saying in my mind how much I missed him, wishing him well. I wondered what heartache those witnesses have caused in a most heartless manner, and who knows how many other people have suffered at the hands of those who so likely claim to serve a great God full of righteousness. Their deeds indeed speak volumes. I had not seen my son for many years since his abduction, but I also knew that within the living universe there always is a reaction and response for every deed and every action. It is a universe of cause and effect. Sadly, my beloved son's childhood had been stolen away from him. Yet I felt that perhaps the silent words I uttered in front of his portrait have been relayed to him through some means we have no knowledge of, for the universe is full of secrets. It was thanks to his mother and the witnesses she worshipped, following their dictates in breaking hearts, that his childhood was lost. But let us consider that one can only know if one has a heart when it breaks. Every time I looked at his image, I mentally told him how much I loved him, but he could not hear me, and all that remained was a wishful desire. His disappearance left a huge gap in my life, making me wonder how his mother and her witness associates felt about destroying a father's heart. They probably felt absolutely nothing, for in their eyes they were always right. They were, as they claimed to be, the witnesses. But were they also by any chance human? In other words, God's prime creation, as they proudly preach? Certainly, there has been much gossip and condemnation of many others like myself, and my ex-partner and her only friends were gullible enough to swallow it as truth. There were indeed those selling shadows, and others who were more than willing to buy them. Whenever I saw a horse, I used to think of my own horses, and imagined Claude was riding them with me. Every time I saw a motorbike, I used to think of my own bike, and imagined we were riding together, and I was happy, in my imaginations, to show him things, teaching him the difference between good and bad. Every time I looked at his image, I always imagined him standing next to me, and I was keenly interested in his welfare, mental health, and education. In my imagination, I saw him becoming an important individual, happy and successful. That was my only consolation. Someone else attending Merva's group was showing great interest in my teachings. This was Lenka from former Yugoslavia, married to a very caring gentleman. Both were sad about the loss of their beloved son, who had recently passed away. Apparently his eyes were shining through mine, and they invited me to their home just to talk. However, the things I told them sounded like their son's concepts. They wondered how I would know things he alone knew. Was it a coincidence? Did we share the same soul grouping? Lenka even wanted to put everything they owned in my name, believing that her son was resurrected in my person, although I was more mature than he. When they invited me to their home, they wanted to discover what foods I liked. Even that was surprisingly just the same as their son. I needed to talk privately with her husband, hoping I could make him understand that I was not who they thought I was. He respected his wife, but did not follow Lenka's thoughts and beliefs. Hopefully, he could convince his wife to think of alternatives. I was not interested in committing a terrible wrong. My knowledge and interests being exactly like their son's was no reason for them to give all their wealth they had worked so hard to me. I could not and would not accept it. All I could do was to decline the offer completely. Her husband was exceedingly happy about my standpoint. Alas, she had too many disappointments in their past, especially when they were involved with the Scientology movement founded by science fiction writer Ron Hubbard. Lenka spoke at length about what they experienced when on board a ship wherein so-called wrongdoers were severely punished by being forced, for example, to remain in dark barrel-like enclosures, experiencing extreme fear, thus feeling their ugly sins. These kinds of disciplining would normally never have been spoken of amongst the followers of their belief system, and I was not sure what to make of it. I was unable to grasp such methods of disciplining being encouraged by their founder, the brilliant science fiction writer and philosopher. However, all their followers considered the science of psychology as being totally evil. It reminded me of times when I occupied myself once at the Drawprint printing company, where I was a camera operator, and where a small-built young Italian gentleman was trying to order me around to do jobs which were not familiar to me. I protested and only did what I was employed for. At the time of my leaving them, the person responsible for the business had somehow discovered about my invention of a brain-wave pattern detector, which was capable of displaying simple geometric shapes created in thought on a computer screen. I had been experimenting with electromagnetic characteristics of the brain and thought generation. Purely accidentally, or you may desire to consider it being under some form of inspiration, I was able to generate the experience which could be repeated under controlled circumstances. After seeing my electronic circuitry designs, they wanted me to develop the equipment purely for their own purpose, to be utilized at Scientology churches. Eventually, I needed to abandon the experience and development of this invention. To begin with, it was going to be very expensive, and there were also others working on similar projects around the world. Furthermore, I had difficulty in accepting the severe opposition against psychology and psychologists experienced in their presence. They knew I studied psychology and constantly subjected me to opposition, often asking me if I had given up practicing this evil science. Interestingly, my ex-wife and her associates considered the science of psychology in the same light. It was certainly interesting to encounter people who often opposed all my undertakings, studies, and interests on one side, and on the other there were many who accepted me with my all. Right in the beginning, when very young, my cousins behaved completely anti-me, as they did towards my brother. I still cannot understand why such behavior was developed, but I preferred to put it on the back burner and forget it, for even then I thought it very naive. They were very young at the time. Then there were Jehovah's Witness friends who were forever opposing formal education, science-related achievements, believing the servants of God needed only be dedicated to preach the so-called Word of God to the multitudes before the end times. Some of my witness friends eagerly advised me on a daily basis that it was better for us young people to sell lemons in the marketplace or clean windows and not worry about worldly education. They insisted that serving and being involved in the pioneering service to Jehovah for the rest of one's life would be far better. Then other friends came along, belonging to the Church of Scientology, and opposed what I had studied, for it was, as they quoted, an evil science. Even Lenka, who was an ex-Scientologist, claimed that Scientology was not a healthy practice. Obviously, this was part of her training, and became an integral part of her education. It seems that everything I have studied, attempted to do, and almost all my interests needed to be undermined, ignored, denied, or criticized by other people. Maybe I should have become a hermit, doing nothing with my existence other than just pleasing them, with my presence, dancing to every tune they played. It is certainly a very peculiar state some of us face in our daily lives. But they cannot and must not dictate our terms of life. Autonomy must never be controlled by others, for life is like a song, and we must sing it by ourselves. I cannot forget my dear mother's words. "My son, you are not like everybody else, for you are you. You are different, and people will see you always like an outsider. You must keep going, son." I could not fathom why she needed to do that. During my youth, before I left my parental home, my mother told me something I cannot forget, and which she also later wrote in her letters to me. My beloved son, you are a gift, and are special for me. And others will not understand that you are different in every way. She once looked in my coffee cup as she continued telling me, "This is why there will be people who would judge you as unstable to undermine everything about you. Be humble, but not unintelligently. Remain meek, and smile often. When you smile, it will always be like the roses springing into a beautiful show, pleasing everyone's eye and mind. But, my dearest son, anyone who will hinder you, undertake responsibilities, and put stumbling blocks on your path for you to fall, will fall on the roadside, and they will all become the things of the forgotten past." In her writing she further advised me, "Do not concern yourself unduly with them, for they have their lessons to learn. Just keep going, my son. Close your eyes to the wrong they do, and forgive them. Forget them if you can, and think that they never existed, for they do not deserve your sympathy. However, love them unconditionally, and be happy." Whenever I was treated unjustly by others, soon after their doors had been closed for good. There have been some who have treated me unjustly, cursing me forever. But believe me, there are no more, nor are their falsified claims remembered any longer, although I could only offer them my unconditional love. People with their pretentious love and care for me, while putting hindrances in my way, have never succeeded. In reality, more hindrances have been created on their path of injustice. This was not dependent on any curse from a witch and wishes from a saint, as some prefer to believe. It was due to a program set in action and triggered only by what they did. I can only keep going without a worry in the world and remain silent within my own reality and my own stream of being, which is based on unconditional and unselfish love. This is who I am, and not what those who can only shun and condemn others try to describe me, without even realizing they do this according to the fullness of their frozen hearts. I have the tendency to adapt to circumstances and unexpected challenges of life. I suppose this became my survival strategy. Thankfully, I trust the natural strengths of life, and by doing so, I remain independent. I do not need anybody's approval or somebody to be on my side to be able to stand on my own feet, for I trust other powers of eternal beauty, creativity, and unconditional love the world would easily discard. Obviously, my mother knew many things, but never revealed much, having her reasons to advise me on something so valuable, although I did not fully understand her at the time. There were others, hearing her wisdom, who treated it as a curse. However, what my mother considered was, as in her own words, people doing unwholesome things always meet their deserved match in the circumstances. People suffer because of the consequences of their own ungainly actions and words. Shout at a mountain, and it will shout back at you. That is the nature of things. While living in Perth, I painted a number of large works of art, including portraits of people and their world, and took countless professional photographs. One day, a young lady visited me at my studio, telling me all about her brother, Lee, who was good in drawing images and artistic illustrations, but was currently not going to school due to personal problems. Since he desperately needed to occupy himself and gain some work experience, she thought my studio could use his talents and give him a sense of worth, a sense of belonging. I was in need of an assistant apprentice, and so decided to give him a chance. I could train and start him in expressional painting and drawing his own works of art. In return, he could help me with the day-to-day running of the shop. But initially I was not going to pay him any wages. However, after a trial period, I would do so. His sister was very happy with the arrangement. The following week she was going to visit me again and hoped she could convince him to come with her. When Lee and his sister met me at the studio, I wondered whether I had understood her correctly about him, for they appeared to be like two sisters. He was extraordinarily gentle but shy, and one could immediately see why he had been constantly teased and bullied at school. Nevertheless, I elected to give him a chance to gain his confidence, to face the world courageously. We spoke for a while and discovered that they had a brother who was a skinhead and always in trouble with the police. The parents were not happy with each other either. Later he told me about his other hobbies such as writing poetry, drawing cartoons, and interest in olden stories of wizards and witches, legends, like the stories of King Arthur and the famed magician Merlin, as well as reading Tolkien stories. He had the tendency to correct my accent rather too often. It was annoying, but endurable. He continued to receive government benefits during this time. Content with the arrangement, he proved himself to be a very reliable young man. That alone was remarkable. However, he often kept away from his father and did not speak well of him. He was petrified of him because he apparently considered Lee as good for nothing, like his older brother, and no matter how hard he tried, he could never please his dad. In regard to his father, he said, Malcolm should be replaced with malfunction. I've seen him treat their mother badly, and so Lee developed unusual characteristics. For instance, he never took his old brown jacket off, and when questioned, he either shrugged his shoulders or declared that he did not want to be exposed. He called his closest friend the jacket as his protective cover. He was an intelligent and talented youngster, but it was evident how this 16-year-old's life had been badly affected, making him feel vulnerable. Among his school friends, he was wrongly judged, thus needing a lot of help. Hopefully, he felt valued and once again alive in the studio. At the end of the day, he never felt like going home, and often said the only thing keeping him there was his mother. A few times his sister and mother asked me where Lee was when he did not go home, wondering if he slept at my place, but that was never the case. Later I discovered to my surprise that he was wandering the streets at night. This sad case reminded me of my younger days. Occasionally he told me he wished I was his dad, and at times asked me in a very shy manner if he could sleep in the shop instead of going home to be shouted at or beaten. It seemed that he did not mind not getting paid for a while, receiving benefits instead, as long as his father thought he was living independently and not needing any parental support. According to what his mother and sister suggested, this way his father would not bother him. This again reminded me of my own youth. He continued spending valuable time in the studio, and whenever I needed to visit people, attend functions, and other engagements, he looked after the place. Although I had been drawing portraits of a number of girls, unusually he never showed any interest in any of them. He was different and completely uninterested in the opposite sex. However, he had no particular interest in the same gender either. The usual belief is that when youngsters are not interested in the opposite gender, they may secretly be interested in their own sex. He was more interested in heroes, villains, and fantasy. Although living a very isolated and introvert manner, in his spirit he was an outgoing but happy to keep his own company person. One hoped he would come out of his shell soon, so that he could be happy with his life, leaving the past in the past. He needed direction to help him gradually accept himself and ever so gently come out of his cocoon. I could probably help him through the discipline of psychology, but I did not want to steer him into some form of dependency. I was not his parent. One day he came up with an unexpected scenario, telling me all about his dream of his mother being married to me, for he exclaimed that his mother and sister spoke very favorably about me. Later still, he gave me a hug, crying, and said he wished so much that I was his father. It was heart-wrenching to see a youth cry bitterly like this. He had a few other concerns. For example, he was convinced that he was the reincarnation of someone from the times of King Arthur and Merlin, the wise wizard. He also spoke of himself being the king at times, and felt I was probably the incarnation of Merlin, also believing he spent lifetimes in distant places, other worlds, claiming with some surety that I was also there. Shortly after, he began to write down his memories over 4 times, with constrained logic, describing his world of fantasy and the worlds he had been to. He even illustrated in pen and ink drawings what he vividly remembered. This seemed to be a world he needed to escape to, even if it was only imagined. It may have been a blend of what he once read, or things he had been told, or born in his rich imagination. I felt he needed direction to make his fantasy creation come to surface, probably in the form of literature and visual art, but he needed to be re-educated about the realism of the world he was born into. He also needed recognition and understanding from others around him. Some of his drawings were similar to the famous Escher's work, but he was not familiar with them at the time. Lee was indeed a very keen teenager, eager to learn the intricacies of art and try his own styles. In other words, he was mature beyond his age. By observation alone, one could clearly see why Lee wanted to turn his world upside down, but one could not guess how he wanted to achieve this. He adamantly kept declaring that he was so certain he had a past history going back to the times of King Arthur, insisting that I was the great wizard. It was also when strange thought patterns on his side started to stream, as he unexpectedly inquired, for example, about stories he had heard or read about where males expressed their feelings of love to each other. I asked him if he meant brotherly love or emotions like sons and fathers. He claimed he was talking about the intimate and romantic kind. Surprising and worrying me. This was going to be a little tough to deal with. I explained that I would like to see him happy with a lovely girlfriend, as it was during those olden days, and I could only consider him as if he was my son. He asked me if King Arthur and Merlin had any intimate relationship. Startled, I tried to explain calmly that I was not knowledgeable about it and did not believe they had any such closeness. He asked me further if they could have slept together, obliging me to explain that it was not my interest. But he adamantly continued to inquire if they had hugged and kissed each other, in a sense confusing me what to believe about his point of view. Obviously, he was indirectly trying to tell me about his innermost wishes and hopes. I explained that parents, indeed fathers and sons, would naturally hug each other. When he repeatedly told me how he wished I was his father, I could understand what he was missing, but it was not my desire to get too close to anybody. All of a sudden he jumped on me, hugging me, his eyes watering. He was shaking like a reindeer caught in the rain. I told him to calm down, but he could not control himself. I knew that he missed such closeness from his dad, but was frightened of him. He started begging me to forgive him, probably sensing he had upset me. I was only surprised. Needing to calm him down, I asked if he would like to join me for dinner. His eyes lit up as he asked me if I could love his mother. What a sad story. Unfortunately, I was going through my own storm and dust devils, and hoped I was not too harsh in my reaction. The situation needed to be treated very cautiously. He was trying to express his inner feelings, which had been suppressed for a long while and had obviously been very badly treated. And now, extremely confused, he was endeavoring to find which way he should go. I had a very strong feeling that deep down he wished that I would adopt him as my son. Knowing my own dilemmas, I thought about my beloved son Claude, whom I had not seen growing up, and the sadness I felt about my own state made me literally cry. I could indeed consider adopting a child, but it could present regrettable problems later. I decided to help Lee as much as I could, and hopefully encourage him to learn to live independently and courageously. I could be like a distant relative, looking after him. I was not prepared to engage myself in romantic interludes with anyone, although I felt strongly that he would love to see me befriended with his mother. Besides, I was occupying my mind with my own disillusions, while also trying to re-establish my own life, disassociating from my dark past, attempting to bury some of the ugly memories, and start everything anew was of utmost importance. I could easily conclude that was why I was engaged in conducting experiments, discovering facts and fallacies. Although I was not prepared for new romances with anyone, helping a young person in need within certain limits would not bother me, but intimate affair with his mother was unthinkable. He happily frequented my Victoria Park studio and shop on a daily basis, performing little tasks. I remember one amusing incident when a group of Commonwealth Bank officials came to visit me about what was happening with extraordinarily overdrawn amounts of money from Lee's savings account. Soon we discovered an unusual electronic glitch with the ATM machine just outside the shop on the main road. Lee apparently had drawn his fortnightly allowance, and after checking what was left in the account he found that the amount taken out was not registered. He thought he would try and withdraw the same amount as before. He drew it again, and the amount taken out was once again not registered. And so, just for the fun of it, he drew his money out several times over, totaling a huge sum. He then took it to his beloved mum to look after. His mother was not told what had really happened, and did some shopping with it. For the 16-year-old, it must have felt that he had hit the jackpot. But now, after it was discovered, the mother decided to repay it. The situation was certainly a sad one, but also very amusing. Lee thought that it must have been the great wizard playing a game with him. However, the bank employees told me that if his card was stolen and somebody else was helping himself, the money could never be recovered. Lee said perhaps he needed to lose his card, making a few people laugh. I was happy that the situation was resolved. One other memory creeps in, making me shiver all over. A lady completely unknown to me, in appearance well-spoken and well-educated, came to the studio. Her name was Margaret, a high school teacher from Sydney, visiting her friends who attended Merva's group, and had apparently heard so many great things about me. I offered her a cup of coffee in the coffee lounge around the corner. She insisted talking to me about something very important, and needed to do it during that very last day of her stay in Perth, and told me she had heard wonderful things about my fame, deciding to see me. Ardently explaining, she spoke all about her profession as a modern history teacher at one of the prominent high schools in Sydney, and exclaimed that the school principal, just like those others from the education department in New South Wales, were all anti her. I asked her why, and she explained in her unique mannerism that she was very depressed, especially when, after almost every class, many of her students, particularly the boys, were unacceptably boisterous and laughing at her. She was advised to consider a medically necessitated dismissal or voluntary redundancy after so many years of service as their teacher. She asked over and over again about what could be the right course of action if she was forced into medical retirement. By that time I had already analyzed her predicament and knew how sensitive this issue was. I asked her a series of questions, one of which was about what she really wanted to do. She answered me that she loved spending much time in ashrams, and the Hindu or Buddhist belief systems appealed to her. She even inquired if I was familiar with the great Indian guru Sai Baba, asking me why I had the same eyes like benevolent Sai. Although I had met Sai Baba during my travels, I could not detect any likeness, and was not one of his devotees. She was also eager to know if I was likely to visit Sydney again, as she seemed to remember seeing me there when I was lecturing. Obviously, she did not have much time left before her flight to Sydney, and I had to get back to my studio. She suggested that if I went to Sydney, I could stay at her address in Cremorne. Strangely, I had once stayed in that lovely suburb for several months, but her address was not in the same street. It was just around the corner in Young Street. Before she left, she said that in the meantime we could communicate over the phone, even though it could be a little expensive, or perhaps we could write to each other. In truth, she appeared to be adamant in trying to pull the strings. I had too many people claiming to be my friends, and at the same time trying to design my life according to their standards and desires. Unfortunately, she proved herself to be a persistent headache. I know it sounds harsh. However, it was as if there was nothing more important than her case in everybody's life. She kept calling me a little too often, in fact, on a daily basis, especially during most inappropriate and unsuitable times, without listening to what she was told, ignoring everybody else's needs, urgently asking many questions and obliging me to make predictions about her future. The whole situation became impossible. From then on, I was frightened about my telephone ringing and listening to Margaret's complaints for longer and longer periods of time. It seemed it did not matter whether I was busy with a client, eating, having a bath, or sleeping. She chose to call me at the most inappropriate times, demanding my attention. I started to hate telephones. She truly rendered herself a nightmare, intruding into my personal space uninvited, and kept questioning me about what I would do if I was in her shoes, obliging me to answer her with the same responses for a very long time. In short, she was relentless, endlessly repeating her same questions. I frequently advised her to follow her own intuition first and foremost, and not my or anybody else's advice. It became so unbearable, making me feel extreme mental fatigue, so that I could not even concentrate upon my own interests anymore, and could not cope with this additional stress. There were times I attempted to speak tactfully and deliberately about having personal problems I needed to take care of, but she either ignored what was said or took it as if I was starving and needing financial help, often explaining that she had spent much money for her travels and phone calls, proudly praising her own self in doing so. At times she spoke over the phone about sex, asking me why I was never interested in it. At other times she asked me when would be the right time for me to consider marrying her. She frequently accused me of advising her to leave her teaching career, and that therefore I should look after her. She relentlessly questioned me whether it was my secret agenda or my alleged desire to marry her. None of it made any sense. To begin with, she did not know me at all, and certainly did not want to know what my background or family situation was. Once she sent a Christmas gift in the form of a small sum of money, which Lee and I shared having a nice dinner in the city, for which I thanked her. As time went on, she claimed she had apparently sent other little gifts like that, but in all honesty I have not seen them, and wondered if she had sent them to the correct address, if at all, or were they secretly taken without my knowledge by my young assistant. Much later, she annoyingly asked me if all the monies she had forwarded to me were used for Muslim terrorist groups. Did she by any chance think that I was a member of a Middle Eastern terrorist organization? If so, why? That was enough for me to desire to escape from her. You can guess what we were dealing with. She was unfortunately leading me into more stress and depression in my life while hoping and pressuring me to further some form of interest to marry her. She elected to continue with this unique behavior pattern, and being unwilling to hurt anyone, I kept swallowing all that nonsense for the sake of peace. When she ended her supposedly vital phone calls, I always wished she would never call me again, giving me some time to concentrate on my own needs. I was certain that as an educated person, she was capable of making her own decisions, yet claimed that I had suggested she leave her employment. But I did not. She did it herself. Besides, if she had not done so, she was going to be medically dismissed. I cannot imagine why I indeed to put up with something like that. She was very keenly interested in everything Indian and Hindu, everything related to spiritual or New Age philosophies. She was of Scottish and Irish descent, did not get along with her mother, hoping that she would choose to stay with her other daughter in the States. She said that her sister was a nurse and her mother suffered mild dementia. My conclusion was that Margaret had a very confused childhood and was seeking answers from all kinds of gurus about life, as with other followers of Sai Baba whom she worshipped. She had been spending a lot of time in retreats and ashrams, where she found solace, acceptance, and trust. She opposed everything science-related, technology, and new discoveries. She interpreted my not being interested in sex as a sign of belonging to a branch of Sai Baba worship. Sai was known to conjure up supposed miracles, spending considerable time with young boys and teenagers in his private quarters, while rewarding them with gold chains and watches he magically produced from under his sleeves. He encouraged his followers to partake in having a form of ash he produced from his body, and some of his followers, as I have witnessed, were rubbing themselves with it, or even putting it in their mouths, considering it as a blessing. All the adherents to his teachings were extremely devoted to him, as was Margaret. However, everybody is entitled to believe in whatever they choose. Some take myths, cultist movements, and guru worship to extremes as it was in olden days. When certain kinds of attitudes from people surface, they tend to develop unusual characteristics. Some develop depression and confusion about their world, as they are constantly encouraged to consider it in a very negative light. Margaret was a person of extremes, unnecessarily serious and devoted to any faith as the wind blew. In reality, she was dedicated to all of them and strict with her undertakings. This may be why she was also so extreme with those students teasing her. She was unable to control them and kept complaining about the boys in particular. She was therefore advised, after much soul-searching and consideration, that she should contemplate taking medical retirement, but she was obviously concerned about losing her regular income, and her mother was not making it easy for her. She sought advice from other gurus and psychics, and in the process became more confused about what to do. I could not advise her for or against anything other than tell her to follow her own heart. She constantly told me that she was. In her dreaming mind, she believed that nobody could help her other than Suren. She had developed a high sense of pride in which she believed she was knowledgeable of all things, trying to convince everybody that she was fully cognizant of all life circumstances and understood how life worked. Advice given at any level had to be very cautiously executed. She believed that I had to be a reflection of Sai Baba. Therefore, I was allegedly a very trustworthy psychic, a mystic, and therefore real. This was so foreign to me. I was surprised that somebody like all-knowing Margaret, who had only met me a short while ago, was apparently able to assess and know everything which needed to be known about my personal characteristics. Who knows, maybe she could enlighten me about my real self and my hidden secrets I had no previous knowledge of. Although I have researched a number of belief systems and cultist ideals people around the world adhere to, I do not follow any religious practice, and wondered if she knew it also. One could assume that she might have discovered, perhaps even psychically, what my cultural background was. Did she also know all about the real me with my professional background? Did she know I was an established artist and research scientist? In reality, she preferred to see me only as a trustworthy medium between the physical realm and higher dimensions. Nothing to the contrary could be explained to her. She also often spoke of another gentleman in most favorable terms. He was writing a book in regard to space-related existences like me. She said that she could love him, but was always told by a woman that he was busy. There was always a woman in those men's lives, and they were like doorkeepers in front of them, ever ready to hinder her from approaching them. She questioned why it was always the same. She was very keen for me to visit Sydney, repeatedly asking me to stay at her place, meet her mother, and even draw her portrait. I could no longer advise her about what to do in regard to her career in any way other than asking her what she really wanted to do. I did not desire to be responsible. She kept persistently asking me what I would do if I was in her position. In fact, if I had such a trauma and facing the prospect of medical redundancy due to my psychological state, I would do the most logical thing. In other words, I would seek the help of a practicing psychologist. She asked me again and again, "Do you mean I should leave? But if I did so, how would I occupy myself? Should I start doing more creative things?" She then almost always added that perhaps she could spend more time at ashrams. Obviously, her self-esteem had suffered greatly, and that was not healthy. However, what kind of creative things did she consider doing in those ashrams she spoke of? Margaret occupied my mind completely, unnecessarily, and far too often. She was not giving me any chance to think and be creative other than advising her repeatedly towards more positive thinking. Apart from my own problems and needs, I had to occupy my mind with her personal issues, responding to her unending questions for hours every day. It was tiring me. In fact, I was beginning to suffer from mental fatigue and desired just to sleep to escape the world that surrounded me. I was overly stressed. Whenever I had time to myself to think about my own needs and concerns or be creative and happy, she bombarded me with her own concerns. I developed a severe phobia towards her phone calls, forcing me to wait until the answering machine started recording before I could respond to anybody. When I heard her voice, I preferred to ignore it, and by doing so was able to create some semblance of peace in my inner world. When I did answer her, she kept telling me all about her dreams, taking hours in doing so. I decided to invest in a speakerphone, which sounded like a radio set. This way, I could let her talk while I did things freely, like going to the toilet or kitchen, when home at night, or on weekends. One weekend, early in the morning, Margaret called me on the telephone, and I put the handset with the loudspeaker on the coffee table, with her voice telling me all about her dreams and went on into the city for a while. And after 3 hours, arriving home, I discovered she was still telling me all about her dreams. Then I spoke to her in just a few short sentences and wished her a good day. She said she would call me next morning to tell me the rest of her dreams. Whenever she left messages on my answering machine, she ceaselessly told me all about her life stories, not leaving any room for other people to leave their messages. This way, some of my prospective clients were lost. I never advised her to leave her teaching career or retire. I left it entirely to her and to more appropriate people to help her decide. Somehow Margaret interpreted my reactions as if I had definitely advised her to leave the teaching position under some form of spiritual guidance, that I was likely to look after her as if I was in love with her. This assumption on her part might have been due to my specialized lectures to the general public, when I used sentences declaring how we need to care for ourselves and how everybody needed to love one another unconditionally. Could it perhaps be the reason, she inquired, why we did not need to express our love intimately in this human world? That was puzzling. While in Perth, I needed dental treatment, but I did not have any major health issues. Although still keeping an eye on my prostate and still very cautious about my diet, my stress levels were extremely high, for I was subjected to much negative input from people who claimed to be my friends. I developed more asthmatic reactions to allergens, increased stress levels, and anxieties were not helping me. I needed to seek a healthier and less stressful lifestyle, for I was in desperate need to be left alone. However, one of my major concerns was the well-being of my children. I had not seen them since their abduction. It was still bothering me, and I had no choice other than consider it as one of the most naive human endeavors I was subjected to, and the cultist engagements, entrapping my family, had once again proved to be the cause of my traumas. What Jehovah's Witnesses have done to me and my family through the auspices of Magda was certainly unforgettable. I was trying to make some sense of life around me by occupying myself with creative endeavors, but certain people I met were not helping. They were devastatingly destructive. I was like a cork thrown upon a lake, just bobbing up and down, going nowhere, feeling like a fish caught in a net of uncertainties. At least young Lee was very helpful in the studio when I needed to go out somewhere. One weekend, another artist with her friends visited the studio, telling us that they were observing these nice people, as they called us, and would love to get to know my young assistant and me a little better. One of the girls was eager to create death masks of people she admired, and asked me if we could help her. Lee and I decided to visit their nearby studio. For this work, lots of Vaseline needed to be used on our faces, with some cheesecloth, and a couple of straws inserted in our nostrils. However, they did not have the cloth and preferred to apply the Vaseline directly, followed by pouring the plaster on our faces. It was not going to take long, as plaster usually sets quickly. Lee's mask came off easily because he hardly had any facial hair, whereas mine did not want to come off, as the whole plaster had penetrated and stuck on my eyebrows and beard. Both girls insisted that I could take it off easily, but I could not wait long. I was becoming breathless, and so broke the plaster cast to pieces, in order to remove it. In the process, I lost some of my facial hair, but the girls were happy, at least to have the impressions of my eyes. Although our ears were blocked with waxed cotton wool, it was not easy to clean them afterwards. The same as my beard. They suggested that we could do it again another time, using cheesecloth on my face. But it never eventuated, as I was going to move back to the eastern states soon. I developed a habit of visiting the markets near my studio. They sold clothing of the kitsch kind, and there were also a large number of eateries. After my shopping, I usually sat and had a cup of coffee, and perhaps a piece of chocolate-dipped Turkish delight, although I did not consume those things often. Rarely did I want to meet any friends in those days, as I needed to have some time on my own. I was really troubled with my tragic past, and the fear of being intruded upon with the concerns of Margaret, which I tried to avoid like a disease. During one weekend, Merva and her brother invited me for a yacht trip around Perth. That was a beautiful experience, as it always was, and exquisitely delightful. Through these water-based mini-holidays, I was able to meet a number of well-known folk who won the America's Cup. A number of wealthy people showed great interest in my portrait drawings and paintings, but that is a different story. During summer, the city sweltered. Air conditioners in the shops could not cope with the heat, and people could not function normally. It also affected me, for the studio became very hot, increasing the financial burden. During these times, people did not want to move an inch, and despite my extensive advertising efforts, I needed to reconsider my position. I began to ponder about my future and financial independence. My work was becoming dependent on seasonal changes, and the heat did not make it any easier during summer months. Certainly, the case of Margaret was creating a lot of unnecessary pressure, which I could do without. One lovely, mature lady visited me in the studio, and while talking to her, she said Johnny Young was her student, and he was a Perth boy. She was very friendly, advising me not to leave Perth, for the general public needed people like me. She said, "Wait a little while, and you will see how things will change for the better." That advice was sound, but making money to live a reasonably comfortable life was equally important. Elizabeth never stopped her advances towards me. Merva never wanted me to go, and Margaret wanted to own me completely. These elements were not needed on my part to create works of art, and also radio programming. I became like a totally stressed-out human wreck. I feel it is a good point here to tell you one other unique story about my involvement with Merva and her family. I remember how Merva and her husband had an enjoyable holiday in their four-wheel drive. And while driving home, one night, they had a terrible accident when their vehicle rolled over several times. Her husband did not suffer any major injuries, but Merva had a few cuts, bruises, and probably also broken bones. She had several scratches and cuts to her head and face, and was extremely traumatized. Very late at night, at her insistence, they came to me directly instead of going to a hospital or doctor. She believed Suren was the only person who could help her. Unexpectedly, waking up from my slumber, I was in shock, but could do naught else other than let her lie down on my spare bed and ask her to relax. I was intending to call an ambulance, but she shouted, "Please, master, I know you can heal me and make me whole again. Please, master." This was a situation I could not get out of easily, and her condition looked urgent. I asked her relatives who came with her to call an ambulance anyway. If she was not all right during the next few minutes, she needed to be taken to the hospital. They agreed, and I started doing what I had never done before, unsure whether I was inspired to utter words in a different tongue, with which they were not familiar, sounding like Hebrew and Aramaic to me. I heard the voice of my childhood friend, who was invisible to others, telling me, in his usual resonant tone of voice, only I could hear, to extend my hands above Merva's body, without touching her, and do nothing else. My hands were sweeping across her face, then her shoulders, and her entire body without contact. I had no control over my movements. I knew that I was not to question what was happening, not even analyzing my unconscious mind. Just go with the flow. Soon after, she said in a whisper that she had no more pains anywhere. Probably her adrenaline levels assisted her feel better. I remember uttering a few more words, which I assumed to be in Hebrew, and which sounded like the ones from Clavicus Solomonis, Keys of Solomon. However, it had only been a curiosity study on my part, and I had not practiced anything like that before, never considering such movements seriously until this moment. My ex-wife and her associates would consider it nothing more than spirit possession, and an evil one at that. I am not going to call it black art, which is always regarded as the practice to do harm. I was aware of my childhood friend telling me to utter the words Jesus had allegedly used when teaching those who asked how best to pray. That was the Lord's Prayer. Since I was not religious, and in truth could never accept any such practice, it was something almost against my will. However, I was not going to interfere. I thought that it was deliberate to fulfill the criteria normal everyday Christians would expect, or help them not to feel as if they were witnessing black art in action. Besides, whatever was happening here was helping her heal quickly. Again, I could probably claim that something currently unknown was activated, and one could never describe it as evil, for it was helping someone heal. The ambulance was due to arrive in about 20 minutes, but when the paramedics examined Merva, they were not going to find anything of concern with her. To tell you the truth, I felt as if I was drifting in a pulsating, brilliant light for a few seconds, which might have felt a lot longer for the observer, during which I was aware of myself as well as Merva being transported to a hospital theater for necessary medical treatment. I saw a lot of electronic equipment there, but could not recognize any of it. I knew a while had passed, but when we returned back to my place, I experienced a similar kind of pulsating light of high energy. However, I could not, nor would, mention anything like that to anybody at the time. I did not desire to create an impression of being unstable in the head, and did not think that Earthian technologies were as advanced as what I had observed. I know that this sounds like science fiction, but I was a direct participant in the experience, and therefore unable to accept it as such, neither a fantasy creation in my imaginative mind. I was certainly not dreaming, and Merva was also a part of the experience. In fact, an ambulatory delay would normally be considered shocking, as during that time the patient could expire. But Merva raised herself and sat on the side of the bed, while her relatives hugged her in great relief, effusively thanking me. One of her relatives said he had never ever experienced anything like this before, but was happy to have Merva back. She kept telling me she knew who I was, and was convinced that she would be completely healed. She kept exclaiming, "Thank you, Master! Thank you, Master!" Her relatives checked her arms, collarbone, ribs, and legs over and over in utter disbelief. They could not believe what had just happened, and what they had witnessed. The whole experience was like a colorful dream. I suggested that she should rest this morning, but if they still wished to go to the hospital for a checkup, I would be happier. I wanted to make sure that she did not have any internal traumas. She asked for a cup of tea. I knew deep down that she was completely healed. She had no bruises. Her twisted arm, possibly due to a broken bone, was corrected, and even when I curiously checked that arm, I could not detect any anomalies. Her adrenaline levels were doubtlessly increased during the process, and in reality would help her feel no pain fast. Maybe she had nothing wrong with her in the first place, and was only in shock, needing some rest. However, those who came with her, helping her lie down on the bed, with much difficulty claimed that they had indeed witnessed something extraordinary, and for me it was an experience I could never forget. When thinking back, I can still see me performing those theatrics without any control over my movements, or the words streaming out of my mouth, during which my unusual experience with the hospital sequence was very real to me. I can never forget how those people shouted in joy, saying, "This can't be! It's a miracle!" However, I could not think of it as if I was dreaming, for it was very real. I could not say what it was and prefer not to analyze it. I asked them to sit quietly for about a further 20 minutes in the dimmed lights before going home. The paramedics could not detect anything wrong with her, other than wonder how her clothing sustained such considerable damage. To lift everybody's spirits further, I offered them coffee and little sweets before they left, Merva unendingly praising me. I looked at her face one more time, and could not believe that there was not a single scratch to be seen. I was not completely attentive to what the others around her were visibly witnessing. I remember her relatives saying that they could literally see the wound closing on its own, looking as if nothing had happened. They all saw it. What I have discovered throughout the years has been clearly described by Stephen R. Covey. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. In fact, people also tend to look at things and not see them, but try to describe what is not witnessed. Perhaps an experience like Merva's needed to be witnessed before anything could be explained. They may have been so traumatized that their minds were creating illusions of reality as they wanted to see. On the other hand, my own experience of the most unusual kind was not describable to anyone. Consider the possibilities. Here I shall attempt to analyze what may have happened, although I might not be completely correct, because I'm unsure what to believe in this unique situation. And I believe Merva was quite capable of healing herself. Was it perhaps a cheap but effective option, as Serapis jokingly told me? However, like many of us, she needed to have somebody or something else to make it real and genuine, similar to what the olden scriptures indicate. Remember Jesus' words, "Your faith has healed you." As humans, we all have the strength and unconscious know-how to change our lives for the better. We can always do the opposite if we so choose, for it is also possible. You may have the very best and rarest piece of art, but as soon as you put it in a frame, it can either gain more value or may look totally marred. Self-confidence and courage takes us into seemingly unreachable heights. It helps us into the actual reality of achievable goals, ones we may have once considered unreachable. Likewise, we can heal ourselves beyond a shadow of doubt and be truly happy. If one believes that holding a pebble in one's hand will open the way to a healthier life, and ardently focuses on it, it is within the realm of positive outcome and possibilities. It is a matter of being focused, but goal-setting without focus is useless. Let us change the subject a little now, and let me take you to a different time when I was invited to attend several meetings organized by the center management, where they proposed that I manage their day-to-day activities. It could certainly be very beneficial for me in the long run, but I declined. At the time, I did not tell them about my ultimate decision. The business was extremely slow in developing, as not initially imagined, even after thorough research right in the beginning, when I believed it was a new experiment to have a studio and an outlet selling art materials in the region. Although the whole street full of businesses, shopping centers, and banks would prefer my business to become permanent, as far as I was concerned, it was an experiment, and I also needed to profit from this venture. I had already decided to vacate the premises sometime soon. Shortly before this, I was asked to draw and illustrate a series of caricatures on the display windows and exterior of a shop which had remained empty for a very long time inside the arcade adjacent to my studio. Originally, I made the suggestion to do so, as it did not look good immediately next to my business. It was not attracting customers. That semi-permanent exhibition of caricatures attracted people's attention. With Lee's help, I first coated the huge area with white acrylic paint, and over this we created the meticulously desired illustrations. The arcade looked so much better with those images than having empty shops with huge floor space. I was asked if I would prefer to move into the larger shop, but I was concerned why it had been left empty for such a long time. I had spoken to friends at the WAUFOIC, WAUFOIC group, as well as Merva's group, about my decision to leave. But some people were saddened at the thought, as they did not want to lose me. The Turkish friends who initially traveled with me from Melbourne and their associates were asking me to stay. Neither did the radio stations want me to go. Nobody wanted me go. However, I had made my mind up to leave with the option to visit this lovely city of lights again. I would probably become homesick for Perth, but something like a magnetic force was pulling me towards Melbourne and Sydney. There was also a very eerie feeling of being a sitting duck in WA. I found myself asking questions like, what if my once beloved but now ex-wife, who became the abductor of our children, was also living in Perth? Shivers passed along my spine, making me shudder. That has indeed dug further into my already gaping emotional wounds. And who knows, I might even experience more severe rejections from my children if I met them by accident, due to their being completely brainwashed against life, the world, and me. Then yet another thought passing through my mind pointed to the possibility of them somewhat still caring for their father, and if they were still capable of thinking for themselves, and also, if the universe saw it fit, they would somehow meet me one day, but that one day may be just a bit too late. Again, I did not know their whereabouts, and so decided to swallow my sadness and bundled my sorrows. Would I choose to stay in Perth if I knew my children were living there? I did not know. I simply had to keep going. I always felt that life had many surprises in store. Having elected to pass the keys to some trustworthy but very neutral friends, I spoke to George Taylor, who still lived in Coolbellup at the time. He and his wife decided to clear the decorations from the empty shop and pass on the keys to center management after I had left. My going away was going to be clean and completely silent, as with my arrival. Nobody would know where I went. I wanted to remain like the wind that came and passed them by. If life had it in store, maybe one day I would see my friends again. It would be wonderful to tell them what the real truth was, but I did not know everything which needed to be known. But did I know everything which needed to be known? Besides, real truth can be experienced whenever it is desired. It is not something we need to rely on what others have told us, but something we can individually experience and know the reality of deep inside our hearts. I could only tell them what was real as I knew it to be, and if they had any genuine insight within their own being and were true to themselves, they could see what is real and what is fake, what is right and wrong. Before I hit the road, I went to see a Mrs. Perkins in another suburb of Perth with a friend. She had her own spiritual research group, which met regularly. Every visitor was encouraged to collect flowers or some plant matter, a leaf or branch, before entering their chapel. They gathered in a hall, wherein guests were asked to place their flower offerings in several baskets provided on a table. They had a little talk by Mrs. Perkins, said a few prayers, asking the assistance of the Spirit, and some hymn singing, but the allegedly inspirational talk contained no real subject, and I personally felt ice-cold air being directed at me. In fact, even when I visited them for the first time, I knew that Mrs. Perkins regretted my presence, and her freezing cold rejection was strongly directed at me. I felt her extraordinary opposition to my being, and could not understand why. Maybe she thought in her fantasies that I was doing harm to her during a past incarnation. Who could guess? She simply resented my person from the very first time she saw me, perhaps because of my looks, having black hair, or being dressed in black, or perhaps my speech being mildly accented. She might have thought of me as the reincarnation of a vampire, or perhaps even somebody like Rasputin. Apparently she was highly spiritual, and clearly regarded me as an undesirable element. However, I ignored all that. During the second half of their meeting, the gathered randomly chose flowers from the baskets delivered by a couple of ladies. Whoever picked a flower or leaf was encouraged to speak of their inner feelings, which they considered as flower reading. Whoever had initially placed those flowers purportedly received answers to their queries from the spirit world or their guardian angels. Sometimes they were apparently receiving messages from their loved ones who had passed on and from God, the universal Great Spirit. I decided to play their game and also picked a couple of flowers from the blessed baskets. I spoke to their congregation about what I felt, as it was so desired. Anybody holding those flowers did not know whom they belonged to at first, until the reading was completed. I felt Mrs. Perkins was deliberately not listening to what I said. I told things to the ladies in the audience who initially placed those flowers there, but I had no knowledge of them in the first instance. I heard a heartfelt cry from one of the ladies. She was saying that she had never heard anything so truthful and genuine until this day, and what I was saying was absolutely correct and spot on. She said the advice given was truly sound. The other lady, who was related to the first, had placed the other flower I again unknowingly chose, and they could not believe it. I said that probably there was a need for both of them standing side by side to receive messages, one after the other. Now both ladies were very emotional, although I always prefer to see people smile and be happy. Their cries were due to being told the truth for the very first time, as they later confirmed. Everybody wanted me to do readings for them, but I also knew Mrs. Perkins was evidently extremely unhappy about my being there, especially when the second lady was so enthusiastic, talking about how truthful my words were, when interpreting the emotions I felt reading her flowers in the minutest detail. I made sure that everybody got something out of my messages of goodwill, peace, tolerance, acceptance, and most importantly, unconditional love. I found myself talking to those gathered where a total silence was experienced. I incorporated my flower reading with important messages to all the assembled. Almost all the visitors and followers of Mrs. Perkins were begging me to come back, whereas Mrs. Perkins completely ignored me, directing her chilling darts. Later, in a soft tone of voice, she told me she would prefer never to see me again unless I just kept quiet and learned a few truths from her. Completely surprised, I simply looked into her eyes and said nothing other than thanks. That certainly was an unexpected surprise, and later, upon their inquiry, I told Elizabeth and my other friends all about it. Elizabeth repeatedly asked me what I thought of the most Reverend Mrs. Perkins after my first visit and the flower reading. In answer, I told her that I did not think much of her other than what I experienced when I put my foot in the building they considered a temple. I was not going to pretend as if I was pleased with the experience, for I was not one of the charlatans. Our world is filled within so-called spiritual circles. As soon as I was seen amidst the gathered, Mrs. Perkins thought I had come there to destroy her and the congregation, because, as I said before, I was dressed in black and had black hair, a well-trimmed black beard, and almost black eyes. When leaving, I thanked Mrs. Perkins again, and saying we were to see each other soon. She responded with a definite preference that we didn't. In reality, I mentioned the words which came to mind in that instant, I was not intending to collect useless clutter, but meet friends. Some told me that I must have heard it wrongly, until they discovered how right I was. Later I furnished a nice letter, thanking her for accepting my visit initially, and her criticisms of my person after that visit. I learned that apparently she was a practicing Buddhist and did not like people with black hair and dressed in dark colors. Would she like me if I was dressed in white, had white hair and eyes? I wondered. My mother used to recite this wonderful philosophy. Who is more knowledgeable between the two, the one who studies hard or the one who travels most?